We try to be open-minded, but I do believe in litmus tests, so the beer you drink, I will judge you for. But there is no beer on tap this morning. So, Morton, can we declare this a safe space? I mean, I think we're all a little beat up, but I want to talk about some uncomfortable things. And let's start with, who are you going to vote for president? Who's voting for Hillary Clinton? By the way, almost always someone raises their hand, so you laugh, but trust me. Okay, Donald Trump. Gary Johnson? Couple hands. Who's not going to vote because it's just too depressing? Okay, Morton, you've trained them well. I don't want to talk about any of that because my thesis is that no matter what happens on Tuesday, Liberty is losing. Liberty is behind. And I was struck by a recent poll, a YouGov poll sponsored by the Victims of Communism Foundation. This is a Lee Edwards project. Have you guys heard of this before? Google it if you haven't. It was new to me, but the findings in this poll were quite striking. Young people today, about a third of them believe that George W. Bush killed more people than Joseph Stalin. Young people today, 40% of them have never heard of Mao Zedong. About a quarter of young people have heard of Vladimir Lenin, and a quarter of them think that he's a good guy. This is where we are today. Maybe you've seen other polls that show that young people are split in a way that is historically unprecedented in the United States between socialism and capitalism. For the first time, a generation of young people are thinking that socialism is better than capitalism. Now, I don't blame young people for this. I think we all know why it is that they believe the things that they believe, that they know the things that they know, and the things that they don't know. I think we've been fighting on campus. We've been fighting mainstream media. We've been fighting the predominant narrative in our top-down media culture that has been telling us now for generations that socialism is cool and capitalism is evil, right? We've been fighting these fights. And it was always an uphill fight. It was always about having to fact check the guy behind the podium, the guy that was writing the evening news, the political leaders that were telling us what to think, and us not really having a great way to fact check them, to respond to them. Responding back in the day was expensive. You had to run a TV ad, or you had to somehow claw your way into the evening news. It was always a losing battle. And here we are today with this reality. How many people did Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin kill? Does anyone know the number?
40 million.
67 million, according to my research, but the reality is that it doesn't really matter, because 67 million is so many people, it's almost inconceivable to get your hands around. Mao Zedong, how many people did he kill?
40 million.
35 to 45 million.
Oh, a lot more than that.
And these are the official numbers, right?
What my family members.
2 of your family members died under Mao. So if you think about that number, let's round it off to 100 million, and I happen to think that that's a fraction of the real number of victims of communism and socialism. But to give you a sense for how big that number is, if you took the victims of socialism and stacked their corpses head to toe, one after another, and wrapped the globe, you could circle the globe 4 times. That's how many people, very conservatively speaking, and I'm not even talking about Cambodia, I'm not talking about various other socialist disasters that have been perpetrated on innocent people. Socialism kills a lot more people than any war ever did. So to compare George W. Bush, and I'm not a big fan of George W. Bush's foreign policy, but to even compare the two is outrageous. It doesn't make any sense unless you've been taught that over and over and over again. This is rolling out before our eyes right now in Venezuela today. The price of producing a beer has gone up 6,500% in the last month. Can you even conceive of what that means? And of course, the cost of buying a case of beer has gone up 3 times in the last month. But in practice, all that means is you can't get a beer in Venezuela. And to me, that would be devastating. And I can't possibly imagine having to survive socialism in any country without a Colt 12-pack by my side. And I joke about that, but this isn't funny at all, because it's an indication of what else you can't get in Venezuela today. You can't get food. Mothers are no longer allowed to cross into Colombia to get food for their children, and they stand in line, but there's no food. You can't get medicine, so state mental institutions have taken to tying down schizophrenics and epileptics to beds because they can't treat these people. There's no medicine, there's no food, there's no clothing in state-run hospitals. Things have gotten so bad that one man was caught stealing $5 in the streets of Caracas, and he was captured by a mob, beaten, slashed, doused in gasoline, and set on fire. This is socialism. Civil society falls apart. Any respect for our fellow humans beings fall apart. And it only gets worse from there. You guys know the stories of Mao's noble experiment in socialism, the Great Leap Forward. He had this idea. Mao was a poet, by the way. And he had this idea that China should be an industrial nation, that China should produce steel. And he was embarrassed by the fact that Chinese peasants were farmers. And so in classic socialist fashion, he came up with a plan. All of the farmers are going to produce steel. In 4 years, he killed 30, 35, 45, maybe more million people. Entire villages were wiped out. People starved. This is socialism in practice. And we see it in Venezuela today, and I've been producing a lot of videos on this subject specifically to make sure that young people will at least hear an alternative view on what's going on. And I get trolled by, I actually get trolled by the Socialist Party now. And it's funny, the responses are so predictable, because you talk about Mao, you talk about Pol Pot, you talk about the Soviet Union, you talk about Venezuela, and the grand design of a Marxist professor from Spain, Alfredo Serrano, who Nicolas Maduro calls the Jesus Christ of economics. Think about the suggestion there, that this guy is so smart that he could redesign things from the top down. The murder in Venezuela comes from an idea. And I want people to know this, but the Socialist Party, every time I tell one of these stories, I hear back, predictably, that's not socialism, that's oligarchy. That's not socialism, that's state capitalism. That's not socialism, that's communism. And they keep clinging to this idea that we could keep trying again and again and again to get it right. because we just need the right person. We need someone that we can really trust with that much power. And if we just do that, we could get to this beautiful world. And of course, when I was in grade school, I was taught a lot of the same things that young people are taught today. You get this spectrum, left to right. And on the left is communism and socialism, and on the right is fascism and nationalism and all those wicked forms of authoritarianism. And we're taught, primarily because of Hitler, but because of other reasons, that the far right, the intentions are really bad, really evil. It leads to genocide. It leads to just awful things. And on the left, socialist experiments like the Soviet Union, it didn't work. We acknowledge that they went a little bit too far, but it's always so sort of suggested that the intentions are better, right? And as an economist, I know that socialism, government ownership of the means of production, and fascism, government control of the means of production, in practice, is actually exactly the same thing. Because you never get to the real socialism, the socialism that Lenin and Engels talked about, which was elimination of the monetary economy, elimination of the division of labor, the point where money and exchange didn't matter. They never get there. But on the way to socialism was something they called dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx and Engels were quite explicit about it, and it's fascinating to debate so-called democratic socialists today when you actually explain to them what socialism is according to the socialists that came up with the theory. You need a lot of power. You need centralized power. If you want to force that many people to comply with the central plan, people are going to die. And it used to be explicit, but today we think we can get to this new configuration, a democratic version of socialism that's going to work. It's going to work this time. Honest. Trust us just one more time. So regardless of who wins on November 8th, we got a big problem. Because it took Pol Pot just 4 years to kill 25% of his fellow Cambodians when he implemented his theory of socialism, which was exactly the opposite of Mao's, but the net effect was the same. Everybody starved. Things can unravel quite quickly, as we see happening in Venezuela today. I think it was just 20 years ago, Venezuela was the role model for economic prosperity in Latin America. This can happen fast. So we should all be sort of freaked out and a little bit depressed that we're facing this challenge no matter what happens in our political process. But I also happen to think that the opportunity for those of us that believe in constitutionally limited government, in constitutional conservatism, libertarianism, the idea that liberty and community and voluntary association is so much more powerful than any planner could conceive of. The opportunity for us today is so much better than it's ever been before. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what we do about the challenge and how we embrace the opportunity that is staring us in the face if we're willing to embrace it. When I was a kid, I was 13 years old, I bought a vinyl rock album. Who's old enough to remember those cool ancient discs that you used to buy in the record store? We have some hands, but vinyl is now cool again because it's what hipsters listen to, because digital's just not as cool because it's so ubiquitous. I bought an album by a band called Rush. It was called 2112. I was rocking out. I was 13 years old. This is the coolest thing ever. And it's a story about an authoritarian government, a benevolent authoritarian government in the future that was dictating every aspect of our lives. And I thought it was really cool. And I'm like, this makes a lot of sense to me. At the bottom of that vinyl rock album, there was a dedication dedicated to the genius of Ayn Rand. I'm 13 years old. I'm like, who's this dude, Ayn Rand? I don't know who that is. And I sure as heck can't Google it because I'm old, and old people didn't have the internet back then. So I stumbled across a small book called Anthem by Ayn Rand at a used bookstore. That copy of Anthem was so old that the dedication up front, other books by Ayn Rand, didn't even include Atlas Shrugged. I stumbled and I went everywhere I could go to. Once I read that book, man, I was in. And I started looking for every book I could find by Ayn Rand. You'd be surprised to know that local libraries and bookstores didn't carry a lot of Ayn Rand when I was a kid. But somehow I found it because I was obsessed, and I went on to find a book by Ludwig von Mises, because in the back of one of Ayn Rand's books, she says, if you want to understand economics, read Ludwig von Mises. I read Human Action when I was 16 years old, and it was the worst dating strategy in the history of mankind. I didn't meet one young girl that wanted to talk about human action. I was so confused. My dad got transferred to Grove City, Pennsylvania. I didn't want to go to college, but Dad was more insistent, as dads are, and he won that debate. I went to Grove City College because it was cheap and it was local. I went as a biology major. Only 2 years later did I get into a heated argument with a friend of mine who teaches right down the street at George Mason, Peter Betke, who is a fraternity brother of mine. We had this argument about the proper role of government that you do when there's no girls at your parties and you got to do something. And he's like, why aren't you in the economics department? Do you understand that there's this guy, Hans Sennholz, that studied under Mises, who is teaching the very sort of economics that you're into? I didn't know. 100 yards away from where I was living was an Austrian professor who had studied under one of my intellectual heroes, and I didn't know. That was the old days. That was the days when Walter Cronkite used to tell you what to think. Do you remember how he ended his half hour of news? That's the way it is. Were you able to respond on Twitter? No, you were force-fed this 20 minutes of allocated news curated by someone you didn't know, and you had no choice. The Marxist professor that was teaching you, probably, you couldn't fact-check him either. You had no way of finding ideas the way that young people do today. Justin Amash, one of my favorite congressmen. You guys know Justin? He is a rock star. He's 37 years old. When you go into his office, you will immediately see a picture in his front office of Carl Menger. Who knows who Carl Menger is? Carl Menger was the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. He developed a theory of money that very much influenced Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, and eventually Ron Paul and a whole generation of liberty-minded intellectuals and politicians. And Justin Amash has a picture of Carl Menger and Murray Rothbard and Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, and a huge Tea Party flag, just to make sure people understand. He went through high school and college and law school and had never heard of any of that stuff. Hadn't heard of Adam Smith, wasn't taught it, didn't know what it was, and he was trying to figure out where he fit on the political spectrum. And he was looking at the Democrats, and I'm not one of those guys. I'm pretty sure that they're way too authoritarian for me, but he was looking at the Republican Party, the same Republican Party, by the way, in his district, that would eventually try to primary him because he was too stridently limited government and free market. And he looked at that Republican Party, sort of a country club Republican Party, and he said, I don't think I'm one of those guys either. So what does he do? What do people do today? He Googled it. He typed in, this is what I think I am, and up pops Friedrich Hayek. Justin Amash self-curriculated. He read all the same stuff I did. I did it by accident. He did it by choice. This is what's happening today. How many people here, young people, How many people were turned on to liberty by Ron Paul? When I speak to student groups, the same way that I would tell a story about Ayn Rand and stumbling across a book, I will hear a story about YouTube. I will hear a story about Facebook or Twitter. And you're talking about a profound disintermediation of knowledge and ideas and information. What do government monopolists do? They hoard information. They don't want you to know. Social media and the internet is breaking up that cartel. It's happening in universities, it's happening in mainstream media, it's even happening in the pursuit of knowledge. I was at a Cato dinner last night with the founder of Wikipedia, who, by the way, bases Wikipedia on Hayek's article, The Use of Knowledge in Society. If you haven't read this article and you want to understand economics, it's easy. This is one of the few Austrian articles that's easy. But it's all about how it is that free people, with their personal knowledge of time and place, come together and sort things out. And through that process, we get knowledge. We get a better understanding how the world works. We create really awesome things that no one's ever created before through a process of creative destruction and entrepreneurship. This is the liberty model, and that understanding of what we believe in is now happening across the board in a grand moment of paradigm disruption that is breaking up the political cartel. Where did Mike Lee come from? Where did Rand Paul come from? Where did Ted Cruz come from? The party didn't want him. The political poobahs fought against them. But they were able to use technology and social media to raise money outside of the party structure, to organize people outside of the party structure, and to get the word out in a way that was inconceivable just 5 years ago. Apply that to everything. Everything is different today if we're willing to embrace a new model. If we have faith that our ideas and our values are so compelling that if we can just connect with people, regardless of who they vote for in this election, we can do things that have never been done before. When I was a kid and I finally met Hans Sennholz, my professor at Grove City College, he introduced me to the Foundation for Economic Education, and I was so jazzed that day that I finally made it up to fee because there were dozens of us. Think about how empowering that is. I wasn't just me anymore being ignored by girls. It was a cadre of liberty fighters working together, talking about how to change the world. Well, at any moment, at any gathering across the country of young libertarian conservative students, there's more people at every gathering than there was, I think, in the entire liberty movement. This thing is growing exponentially. And I think all of the lessons that Morton has taught us all of these years about community organizing, and I'll use that word, I think we should take the word community back from the left. It's our word, it's not theirs. Community means voluntary association and cooperation and respect for our fellow citizens, right? So I'm a community organizer. And we need to organize people. We need to do it in a way that appreciates how technology works. So one of the reasons I left FreedomWorks was because I thought that the opportunity before us is bigger than politics. I felt like we needed to get upstream of politics because one of the downsides of politics, even amongst conservatives and Republicans and libertarians, is how it divides people. Man, when we start fighting about our favorite candidate, people stop talking to each other. You've probably all heard that families are breaking up right now because there are Trump and Clinton supporters at the same table. This will not stand. But if we get upstream of politics and we use technology and narrative and social media and video and conversation, we could find a common set of values that make not just all Americans Americans, but make people people. that is the opportunity. The eyeballs available to our ideas are unmeasurable. So part of what we need to do when we're talking to young people is appreciate the world that they live in. They are the ultimate libertarians in practice because they curate everything, every day. Remember when Democrats criticized George W. Bush's plan to offer tiny little savings accounts where you would have 3 savings options? The Democrats said, that's way too many choices. There's no way that people can handle 3 choices. Any morning, any minute of any day, a young person has made more choices than us olds could even conceive of. They curate everything. They curate their music. They curate their friends. They even curate communities like CrossFit based on a mutual set of goals and based on mutual respect. Almost sounds like a Hayekian world to me. But young people, as far as I can tell, aren't particularly interested in choosing a team. They're not going to accept a one-size-fits-all solution from Team R or a one-size-solution-fits-all from Team D. I think they want to curate their politics and their values in the same way that they want to curate their music. They don't want someone to tell them what to think, what to do. They want to work through it by themselves, which is why we need to have this conversation upstream from politics. So my new organization, Free the People, is intended to try to help to figure some of this stuff out. And if you'll notice when you go to our website, it's not red, white, and blue. There are no tricorner hats. There are no eagles vomiting fire. And I didn't realize that the Libertarian Party's colors were yellow and black, but it's yellow and black for different reasons, because I thought it looked cool. And the first person I hired was an actor who really understands video. The second person I hired is a graphic artist that's really deep into the comic world, and you can see from our look and feel that that's what we're going after. And the third person was a young woman who I'd worked with at FreedomWorks who understands social media and how to drive a conversation online. Little old Free the People, we're less than a year old. We currently reach 80 million people a month with our videos. The marginal cost of doing that is almost zero. And that's not nearly enough, but man, is that a start. Do you remember the day when you had to buy a TV ad? How much would it cost to buy enough points on TV to reach 80 million people a month? Wasn't going to happen. And that's why the establishment always won. They had the money, they had the corporate relations, they controlled everything from the top down. They don't do that anymore. So let's embrace sort of this beautiful chaos of technology and social media. Let's have enough faith in our ideas that we can reach people who we don't think are like us, that we think might be playing for the other team. I want to talk to young, disaffected Bernie Sanders supporters. I want to talk to young conservatives who are never Trump. I want to talk to libertarians who think that Gary Johnson is a squish because he doesn't know what the non-aggression principle is. I want to talk to everybody because I think that we're going to find that for once in our lives, the values of liberty and the values of cooperation are far more compelling than socialism ever could be. Thank you very much.
All right, are there questions for Matt?
Two quick questions, please. One, your thoughts on the Constitution's provision for Article 5, Convention of the States, as a way for the people to take power back from Washington. And secondly, your thoughts on Obama's surrender of ICON and the prospects for restrictions and encroachments on liberty on the internet.
So I like Article 5, and this election, if any, is going to make you take a second look at constitutional ways to restrain the behavior of both political parties. And I like it perhaps for the reason you suggest, is that the very process of organizing a grassroots movement to support a new constitutional convention would be in and of itself a very powerful vehicle to educate people about the Constitution and the rule of law. By the way, I suspect that young people, when we say rule of law, they're thinking the man is going to tell me what to do. So they're thinking the exact opposite of what we mean by that. Honestly, I don't know enough about this, but I don't think the threat is nearly as existential as Ted Cruz has suggested. But I do think that we should be endlessly vigilant about protecting speech online from attacks both the left and the right. Tyrants, the first thing tyrants do in a grassroots uprising is they shut down Twitter. There's a reason for that, because social media is power and speech is power, and we should no matter what our political stripes is, we should protect that first.
Thanks. Lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Barbara Dello, and thank you. I just was wondering, is a kind of a libertarian and particularly an economically based libertarian small government model, does that work side by side with more principled Republicans or with more compassionate conservatives, or do they come out at odds where the social issues really divide the two sides? Because that's kind of playing out in my committee in my town.
Okay, that is an awesome question, and let me say something that's potentially controversial here. I think that a good libertarian can be either a social conservative or a social liberal, because the very basis of libertarianism is skeptical of government's involvement in cultural life. We're skeptical, for instance, that government can define, based on a 5-4 vote in subcommittee, what marriage is. I would love for social institutions and churches to define marriage. I don't personally like the idea of getting permission from the government when I got married. So if you think about it that way, a lot of these cultural fights that we have, I have a lot more faith in society to fix those things than I do Washington, D.C. And then a lot of the fights that we have between libertarians and conservatives is really a fight between what I would call neoconservatives, who want to use the power of the state to impose a certain set of values on everybody else, versus libertarians who would be skeptical of that kind of activism for the very reasons that I just said. Politics is a really bad way to decide things that are really important. They can't even balance the budget, and yet they're going to have an opinion about my relationship with my wife. I don't think that's cool. So one of the things that libertarians make a mistake on is, and they buy into this, and Bill Weld has bought into this, right? He says, I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal. That's not what a libertarian is. A libertarian is skeptical of the government's ability to replace really valuable social institutions with a political process.
Gentleman right there, raising his hand. No, the guy right there, Jordan Davis.
Hi, fast question. Years ago, I was a member of the American Association of University Professors. My recollection is that Grove City must have set some sort of indoor record in terms of the number of years that they were on the no-no list from the AAUP. And I just wondered if you had any knowledge as to what the source of the conflict was.
I think the source of the conflict is pretty obvious. Grove City and Hillsdale and a few other stalwart colleges aren't interested in complying with either the regulations or the ideological agenda of most education institutions. When I went to Grove City College, Ted Kennedy was relentlessly trying to regulate Grove City, and to the point where Grove City decided to opt out of even Pell Grants because they said, okay, you're going to keep trying to regulate us if we take even if a student takes government money. So we said no. I think that's a great model. And today, I would argue that you're going to see a blossoming of more institutions just like this, taking on all sorts of forms that probably don't involve bricks and mortar. And the education cartel is just as endangered as the political cartel for that reason.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. This gentleman here.
Hi, Carl Gollivan. Matt, I was going to ask you about whether central banking and the way it facilitates corporatism needs to be overcome with a return to an honest constitutional monetary standard. But more importantly, Pilsner Urquell is one of my favorite beers, and could you comment on the devaluation of the 12-ounce standard? Because Pilsner Urquell is now sold in an 11.2-ounce bottle, and I find it troubling that this could spread to other beers as well.
I assume that is a European Union thing, and now I got to give a long answer on beer. So in Germany, there's this ancient purity law called the Reinheitsgebot, and the Reinheitsgebot is celebrated by Germans as making our beer is so much better because it's pure. Well, of course, this is a regulation that was imposed by Bavaria to screw brewers in northern Germany. It was a form of protectionism. And today in Germany, really awesome brewers like Stone Brewing have moved into Berlin because, as it turns out, German beer drinkers want interesting beer just like the rest of us. And you're having all this disruption in beer driven by the American model. And the American model is radical entrepreneurship and radical disruption. Ludwig von Mises said that the entrepreneur is the guy that can look around the corner of history and do something that no one's ever done before, even as everybody else laughs at him. And the other night in Anchorage, Alaska, I had a triple IPA that was so hoppy that it melted my face. That's freedom in a glass.
Okay, one more question. The gentleman there. Nope. Raise your hand again. There you go.
In a country of 300 million people and the ideological diversity that entails, is your community model kind of based on like retreat and consolidate and fortify?
No, it's the opposite of retreat, and I happen to think that the only way to accommodate the insane and beautiful diversity of the American people is through a platform called liberty. You're never going to unite people based on one top-down one-size-fits-all plan like the progressive model would suggest. Does Obamacare work for everybody? No, and it never could because we're all different. And that's the beauty of freedom and cooperation, is that it accommodates the insane diversity that we have. And I think that's what we're learning in politics. We've already learned it in music. Everyone's at the long tail of the internet getting really cool music that no one else ever heard of. But when it comes to politics, we're asking young people to shop in a mall in Caracas. There's nothing on the shelves, and there's this tired old thing called the Republican brand, and there's this tired old thing called the Democratic brand. And kids today are like, what the hell is this? I'm not buying this. So I think we're at this moment where we should be talking to people. I'm part of a progressive working group. I'm their token conservative Tea Party libertarian, and they sort of stare at me like I've never seen one of those guys before. But I'm learning from them about narrative. They know how to tell stories about real people, and we need to do that. Like, our stories and our values, I think, are really compelling, but we're still stuck with spreadsheets and downward sloping demand curves and acronyms that no one knows what the heck we're talking about. Why don't we speak in English? Because I think we could connect with a lot of people.
Great.
Thank you, sir.